I'm Smita Nair. This is your weekly fix. Ever so often, particularly during election season, promises made by political parties to provide cash transfers for certain sections of society or distribution of certain goods revives the debate over what is disparagingly referred to as freebies. The ongoing discourse was prompted by the Prime Minister's comments on what he called was the propagation of revdi culture. The Aam Aadmi party saw this as a barb aimed at them because of the party's success in the Punjab elections and potential to spring a surprise in Gujarat that goes to the polls later this year. If voted to power in the state, the AAP has promised, among other things, to deliver 300 units of free electricity. Now, the matter was escalated by the Supreme Court's decision to admit a PIL asking to restrict freebies. The Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, the DMK, seeking to be heard in the matter, told the court there was no straitjacket formula to determine which scheme deserves to be called a freebie. It said the Constitution empowers states to promulgate welfare schemes. The term freebies cannot be interpreted to restrict the state's competence to provide welfare. Went on to say that such schemes have been introduced in order to provide basic necessities which poor households cannot afford. They cannot be imputed to be luxuries. Schemes such as free electricity can have a multidimensional effect on a poor household. The party which leads the government in Tamil Nadu asked why are welfare schemes introduced by state governments alone branded freebies? Why not put the centre's tax holidays for foreign companies, waiver of bad loans of influential industrialists, and the granting of crucial contracts to favoured conglomerates in the same bracket? Many independent commentators also see the Supreme Court's intervention in this matter as problematic and judicial overreach. Today, the Supreme Court transferred the matter to a three-judge bench. As for Mr. Modi's revdi remarks, critics say they're merely a smokescreen intended to take the focus away from his failure deep into his second term to deliver on his promise of creating tens of millions of jobs, on economic growth that he had said will empower citizens and not let them be dependent on handouts. Be that as it may, there are many aspects to this debate that need clarity. Yamini Iyer is president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research. Her particular focus is in the fields of social policy, state capacity, and development. Ms. Iyer has kindly agreed to help us understand the subject. Thank you, Yamini Iyer, for making the time for speaking to us here at Scroll.
Thank you. It's an absolute privilege. I'm a huge fan of Scroll.in, and so it's always a pleasure to be part of your platform in any way.
Right, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Ms. Iyer, before we get to the questions of what constitutes a welfare scheme as distinct from a freebie, or the determination of whether a scheme creates value or builds capacity in tangible ways, can we focus on what this debate is premised on? Fiscal drain, public debt, the current position of state finances. Allow me to cite a couple of things. In April this year, it was reported that several senior bureaucrats briefed the Prime Minister on the growing debt burden and flagged that some states might be going the Sri Lanka way. The Reserve Bank of India carried in its June bulletin state finances, a risk analysis. It had data on what it called was rising expenditure on non-merit subsidies. My question to you is, are these alarmist, politically tinged takes at a time when center-state relations are at a low? Or is there indeed truth to the assertion that, to quote some of those bureaucrats, there are some states that run the risk of going the Sri Lanka way?
The Sri Lanka way is a misnomer, simply because the central government is the guarantor, and states have to constitutionally move to this, look to the central government if they are borrowing beyond the borrowing limit. So it is unclear to me how we will ever find ourselves with states going the Sri Lanka way. If at all, it would likely be that the country as a whole, the national government, if it manages fisc badly, could possibly go the Sri Lanka way. And by the way, we are not anywhere near that. So the Sri Lanka way is a complete misnomer. However, the question of fiscal management of state budgets versus central budgets or in fact, actually, the question of fiscal management per se is an important one. It is the responsibility both of the state as well as the center to ensure that its fiscal health is strong and its management of public finances is appropriate. There is an architecture of fiscal rules and a FRBM Act that lays down how fiscal targets of what states and center have to meet. And it is part and parcel of the process of appropriate fiscal management to consistently look at what the state of public debt is and how fiscal health is being managed. Is it the role of the center to question states' management? Constitutionally, I don't see how. It is the RBI certainly plays a role, and it does so periodically through through various mechanisms. But ultimately, the center's own management of its own fiscal health has to be looked to. The center has greater monetary and fiscal powers than states, and in that sense, the fiscal health of the center ought to be a bigger matter of conversation and debate than that of states. States' management of their own fiscal health is certainly a question that needs to be addressed. What we lack in the Indian context is an appropriate institutional architecture for transparently, deliberately, appropriately debating and discussing the fiscal health. It has been argued consistently by several luminaries, that including central finance commissions, that India should set up a fiscal council, the purpose of which would be both to articulate a midterm fiscal framework and transparently monitor, observe, and debate the fiscal health both of the center and the state. The center has not moved in that direction. Instead, it chooses to non transparently, without deliberation and dialogue, have these conversations. One last point, fundamentally, it is the role of the Legislative Assembly to overarchingly monitor the fiscal health of states. It is absolutely true that legislative assemblies are not performing that role. But is that for bureaucrats of the central government to fix, or is that part of a broader political question, an institutional question that needs to be addressed? Is a question.
What some, like Mr. D. Subbarao, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, the former finance secretary, in an opinion piece he wrote in the Hindu, he referred to what he said was a dangerously rising off the books borrowings by several states. I was hoping you would help us understand exactly what off the book borrowings mean. I just briefly wanted to tell our viewers that all states, if I'm not wrong, and center is deficit financed, as in there's no excess revenue, so everybody borrows. But what is off the books borrowing is what something I wanted to understand. The other point, again, there have been several reports in the last month or so since the Prime Minister spoke about this freebie culture, where unnamed bureaucrats from the finance ministry have been quoted to say that the states are raising loans by escrowing future revenues and pledging sovereign assets. And this is a very dangerous and recent trend. So these two sort of aspects, could you help us understand? Off the book borrowing and this sort of pledging of sovereign assets and escrowing future revenue. What does that really mean?
Just to explain in simple terms, off-budget borrowing is essentially a clever accounting way of ensuring that your borrowing needs, if they exceed fiscal deficit targets or the target that is set, can come through our agencies, can come in ways that don't reflect on the budget. So essentially what government often does, and both central and state governments have indulged in this practice, is to get government agencies. So for example, the Food Corporation of India, which is the state government's agriculture procurement agency, to borrow on behalf of the government. The government then funds the schemes, uses that money to fund its schemes. In this case, the public distribution subsidy scheme, the PDS, and repays the loans from its own resources, but it doesn't show up in the government's budget. So it allows you to run your scheme, even if you don't necessarily have the revenues available with you to run the scheme. It ensures that you're within the limits that have been set by fiscal rules. And over time, government pays it off. Now, the thing is that the government is the borrower, right? So it takes its own time to make repayments. And as it did with FCI's budgets, it took a while to actually repay, which essentially meant that these agencies were taking large amounts of loans and paying interest. So it took for all the way to 2019, when the government of India, largely on account of the fact that it had been called out repeatedly for off budget borrowing, to make its off budget borrowing, or what it calls in budget documents, extra budgetary resources, completely transparent, and declare how much it was borrowing from through the FCI, who was borrowing through the NSSF, the National Small Savings Fund. And it took till after COVID, I think it was the 2021-22 budget, to say that we are going to stop this practice going forward. So states do this too, but so does the center. And it is on account of a very fundamental public finance challenge that the government of India's fiscal management has been dealing with for quite some time, but more sharply in the years 2017, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, where it consistently failed to raise revenue per its own targets set in budget, consistently as a percentage of GDP. And that had to do with many factors, including the slowing down of the economy and policies of the government itself, particularly GST, the expectation that GST will lead to revenue buoyancy very quickly turned out to be a false expectation, and contributed to a huge gap in revenues expected in the budgeted estimates or the start of a budget, and revenues actually collected as declared in the actuals of the budget at the end of the financial year.
Okay, got it. Just one more question on this, center state difference of opinion on how things actually are. The Tamil Nadu Finance Minister, Mr. Thiagarajan, in an interview, I think last week, sort of called out what he said was the center's claims on, states sort of arbitrary borrowing, as he said. He said under 293.3, this particular government, 293.3 of the Constitution, this particular government has been exercising full control over state borrowings. The provision in the Constitution that, of course, says that if the state owes the center, if there's an outstanding loan, the center has a sort of right to decide on the state's borrowings. Is that a factual description of things as they stand, that the center controls the state's borrowings to a large extent under this provision of the Constitution?
Which is precisely why the Sri Lanka argument makes no sense.
Right.
And in fact, so two things here. In the middle of COVID, where the bulk of the expenditure responsibility rested with states, health, upgradation of health facilities, responding to social protection related issues, etc., were firmly things that the state governments had to do. State governments repeatedly appealed to the government of India for more fiscal support. Now, one of the requests that came from states was to increase the borrowing limit, in order to allow states to borrow more to meet their expenditure needs, given that the button of the economy had been switched off and revenues crashed as was expected. Eventually, I forget the chronology, but somewhere in the midst of 2020, this was finally agreed upon. So borrowing limits went up to about 5%. But the government of India also exercised its own rights to introduce certain sets of conditionalities over proportions of that borrowing, including municipal finances, local government finances, and power sector reforms. So the government of India has been quite effective at exercising its rights vis-a-vis states. The question is, to what extent is the government of India imposing its will upon states? And that's where aspects of fiscal federalism that have been fairly fraught over these last few years come into play. Just one important point here, that given the nature of our public finances, where essentially government of India has larger revenue raising capacities, or rather powers, while state governments bear the bulk of the expenditure responsibilities. So many call it the one third, two third issue. It is through the Finance Commission, there's a process of devolution determining how much of the taxation that sits within the shareable pool, it's called the divisible pool, money taxes that can be shared between center and states. This determination is to be made on by the Finance Commission. Since the 14th Finance Commission, steps have been taken to expand the amount of funds that are given to states, a devolution that is made to states. It went from 32 to 42% in the 14th Finance Commission, and stayed at about at 41% in the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. But the government of India used its own fiscal powers, used another tool called cess, to which essentially are special purpose taxes or sources of raising revenue, which are not part of the divisible pool, the shareable pool, and are kept within the arms within the ambit of the central government. As a consequence, the total amount of resources, tax resources that are devolved to states, never met in the 14th Finance Commission period the 42% that the 14th Finance Commission had said, and it remains far under the 41% that the 15th Finance Commission has laid down. So essentially, the center has, through various clever ways, essentially shared far less of what are states' rights, and at the same time exercised its powers over states by imposing conditionalities on what states can and cannot do.
Okay, interesting. To the moot sort of term that we are talking about, freebie, do you agree, Ms. Iyer, with the contention that any public outlay must create value, generate employment, and/or build capacity tangibly? And really, how is this determined?
So, first of all, I wanted to thank you. In your opening remarks, you are probably one of the few people who just put it out there, disparagingly use the word freebies. I've been extremely uncomfortable with the way in which the entire debate has unfolded, and the word freebies has sort of entered into our political discourse without anybody questioning what it means. When we use words like this without recognizing their import, we normalize these words in our political discourse, and they're hugely problematic. There is no such thing as a freebie. We are a democracy. Government gets its resources through fundamental 101. We pay tax, and what government does for us is for us determined on the basis of a political contract. It is not a freebie. Having said that, the question of what government should spend its resources on and what value add those resources will have is certainly a matter of public debate, and in a democracy ought and must be debated. But who is to determine what that value add is? There, there is, for example, I was watching a TV debate in the middle of all of this freebie discussion, and someone interviewed various women in Tamil Nadu about the color TVs that have been at the center of what everybody so obviously says, oh, that's state largesse. Is it for the government to be handing out these private goods? And these women said, well, it breaks boredom. It gives us our whole day is spent in drudgery work, and this gives us the opportunity to just relax for a while. Welfare could also well be defined, as many countries in the world have, as well-being. This is part and parcel of determining that well-being. Feminist economists have long studied the impact of drudgery of housework. If we can break that drudgery of housework through the provision of a color TV, well, so be it. I mean, you can make a very rational argument this way. And so I think we end up in a very troubling place if we argue on what is and isn't value add, or what is and isn't freebie. There's no question that government resources are limited, that these resources are also our resources. And we must put a check on government's profligacy if those resources are being spent poorly. But that determination, I believe, has to be made in the context of an economic plan, an economic articulation. At this point, what we have is national and state governments announcing targets: $5 trillion economies, $3 trillion economies, $2 trillion economies. But they don't specify what is the expected pathway by which they are going to achieve this. If you don't know what that expected pathway by which you're going to achieve this, on what basis can you argue about where and how government monies are being spent? So, you could argue that I will not spend money on health and education and spend money on building highways because road connectivity will enable mobility, movement of goods, will encourage manufacturing, will create revenues, will generate jobs, generate revenue, and then I will invest in health and education. It's an argument we can have. We can argue about multiplier effects, but it's a logical argument to make. But you have to tell me that's my path.
I also want your view on how you would sort of characterize the corporate tax cut of 2019 and the sort of massive revenues foregone thereby, as also what the government informed the parliament earlier this month about the 10 lakh crore bank loan write-off. Many of them, and they gave a list of the top 10 sort of willful defaulters, and they're all top corporates. Those who are opposed to this attempt by the government and by the PIL and the Supreme Court of clamping down on social welfare by dubbing it as freebies, question the government and ask them, why shouldn't these corporate tax cuts or these loan write-offs also be seen as a drain on the public exchequer and therefore also be characterized as freebies or subsidies?
Well, that's absolutely the point, in a way, in that what is the growth path? What is the imagination? What is the articulation for the economy? Absent that, absolutely. One man's freebie is another man's welfare. So for elites, for corporates, corporate tax cuts have a logical narrative around their ability to incentivize, become more competitive, invest better. Just as for the poor man, investing in even a color TV, but also bicycles so that the girl can go to school, but also possibly laptops so that young children you can bridge rather the digital divide. Also in schools, also in health centers, all of them collectively enable people to build their human capital, become productive, and participate on a level playing field within the economic activity. So it's that can be viewed as a freebie if you're a corporate honcho, quite rightly, as for the person who is looking for investments in their own productivity for the poor, who will rightly look at what we are doing with corporate honchos and say that is freebies. Unfortunately, the voice of the corporate honcho is far louder than the voice of the ordinary citizen. And if you ask me in terms of multiplier effects of what can genuinely build an economy, in my view, the multiplier effects of investing in the welfare of the vast majority are significantly higher than the multiplier effects of investing in the comforts of a few wealth creators. Not to argue that we don't need wealth creation, but to argue that we have to see where the most gains are. And there will be far greater gains in investing in people than there are in allowing for the top 0.001% of India to be so-called more competitive and essentially get away with bad fiscal management of their own kind, which are the loan write-offs. At this equally, it is important for us to look at the history of our economic trajectory since 1991, when India opened up. We did many things, including tax cuts and tax cuts in particular for parts of the service economy, to make the service economy more competitive, as it was a services economy that was largely on the back of which the Indian economy was growing. While the Indian economy grew, and through the trickle down of effects of that, we managed to lift the largest number of poor out of poverty. The bulk of those poor remain in what the World Bank describes as a category of the vulnerable population. About 50% of India remains vulnerable, which is essentially one income shock, one thing that could happen to you. Somebody in the household falls ill, somebody loses their job, that they fall back into poverty. So these are people in extremely precarious forms of level at precarious levels of income because they have precarious forms of employment. It is for that reason that they are not able to save and they are not able to invest well and not able to move from being vulnerable to middle class. If you look across the globe at what countries spend on welfare, India actually is at the lowest level compared to any other comparable country, Brazil and China, or OECD countries, including, by the way, the United States, where we see a smaller state compared to, say, the large European welfare states. So India spends about 3% on social protection compared to 5% and 6% in OECD countries. India spends less than 3% on education compared to 6% in European countries. India spends less than 2% on health compared to 9% in European countries. So, what is this conversation we are having about freebies? It puzzles me immensely. The economy grew on the back of wealth creators who got tax loans. They're still asking for them. That was the corporate tax rate cuts. On the argument that this is going to generate competitiveness, which will create a virtuous cycle of private investment and jobs. But effectively, if you look at where how our economy has grown, we haven't really invested in people. As a consequence, bulk of people have not been able to participate in these jobs. The only jobs we created, as economist Amit Basole's really wonderful new paper reminds us, has largely been in construction. Those are precarious, informal jobs, which you can lose at any point in time. We saw during the lockdown how quickly you lose those jobs and how little you have to fall back. And it is for those that these freebies, so called disparaging freebies, are being discussed. Whereas all the cuts that we gave and the concessions that were made to enable industry to grow have not necessarily trickled down in the way that they ought to. So here we are having a live debate on so called reveries for the poor, but really only occasionally muttering about what it means, whether or not corporate tax cuts should be called freebies or not. If we are going to use the freebies, then absolutely anything that the state gives us is a freebie.
All right. Just a quick final question, because the matter is in the Supreme Court. Earlier today, the matter was referred to a three-judge bench. In the course of the hearing, we heard from the Apex Court that they're considering forming an Apex committee of experts from here, there, and the other. I remember on the day the Supreme Court said this, Anjali Bharadwaj, the rights activist, had expressed concern over what she thought would be this rule of technocrats. And she said technocrats are typically biased against welfare schemes. Look at how they responded to Manrega, to food security, when it was in the throes of discussion. Uh, we've heard from the DMK as well, responding to a potential sort of team of technocrats regulating welfare schemes by saying that you cannot have one sort of executive committee at the center look at what is a heterogeneous country, and the socio-economic needs of each region differ from the other. Are you concerned about how the Supreme Court could potentially, I don't know in what manner, but going forward, regulate what states can possibly spend money on?
Oh, absolutely. I argued at the start of this whole drama, so to speak, that it is the worst form of judicial overreach. This is not a job for the Supreme Court to take on. In fact, the 2013 judgment quite clearly said so to my reading. Yet the Supreme Court, that has actively and carefully chosen not to do its job on many other critical matters of political rights and civic freedoms, seems to have taken it upon itself to examine this matter in great gusto. This is not a matter that can be determined by technocrats, precisely for the reasons that we have been speaking about. It is for technocrats to do their job by presenting different pieces of evidence on what different kinds of investments of public finance can yield in terms of quality of returns, quality of outputs, outcomes, etc. But ultimately, this is a political determination. As Anjali said, and that there was a live and very, very hot debate that took place when NREGA and, in fact, the public distribution scheme was to be expanded in alignment with the National Food Security Act about whether or not this was fiscal profligacy. Many argued at the time that instead of digging holes into nowhere, the government would be better off taking helicopters and dropping money in rural areas so the elites can grab it, because the poor aren't going to get this in any case, apparently, because of corruption. And eventually, it took a huge civil society movement and a political push to get these laws passed. And most experts argued against them. Yet, if we hadn't had the public distribution system expanded in the way that it had been expanded because of the National Food Security Act and the architecture of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in place at the time of COVID, we simply would not have been able to ensure that most Indians did not starve when we switched the button of the economy off. So, the determination of welfare is one of those rights that the poor fight for the most. It is actually it is a tribute to democracy that these laws exist and that the Indian state was pushed to expand its welfare, even though it did it hesitatingly, carefully, slowly, grudgingly, because of democratic pressure against the backdrop of liberalization, which usually sees retreat of state. We certainly did see retreat of state to a degree, but it was pressures of democracy that ensured that we saw some expansion of welfare. And it is pressures of democracy that should determine what is a good freebie and a bad freebie. And I hope it is pressures of democracy that will push our politicians and our legislative assemblies to take their jobs more seriously. What are their jobs? Articulating clearly to the people from whom of their states and the people of India whom they represent, what their plan for economic growth is, articulating clearly how they are going to manage their fiscal health as they achieve their goals, clearly debating in their legislative assemblies and in parliament their budgets and budgetary choices, so that we, the citizens, have a better understanding of exactly what choices are being made and why. And that when we have debates like this, at one level, this is a healthy debate to have. The Prime Minister may have unwittingly opened us up to a good, healthy, democratic debate on what the state should do vis-a-vis its citizens, what is welfare, and what is possibly a freebie like corporate taxes. But this requires commitment from our politicians. It cannot, it must not, and it will not be imposed by the Supreme Court and by expert bodies.
All right. On that note, Yamini Iyer, thanks so much for your time and for your insight.